Erev Tov, we are embarking, probably an appropriate term for Parashat Lech Lecha, with Rav Bazak's starting point. There are 7 essays, 7 comments for this Parashat. We're going to try to see if we can get through 4 of them. We'll see how we do. I think numbers 1, 5, 6, and 7 are my goals. We'll start with the beginning and see how we do. So beginning straight away, and the first one, in which Bazak, a little bit more than we've seen necessarily, quotes a couple of the medieval commentaries. So not they're very much focused on the Pshat, and so it fits in with his approach to Pshat. But rather than just really looking at the text on its own terms and parallel passages, literary analysis, he kind of frames the question as a debate amongst 2 classical medieval commentaries. We'll see how that unfolds, and we see a little bit more of that on this week's Parashah. So he quotes the verse that it may go well with me because of you. We'll see what he's referring to in a moment. And he begins, commentators are divided about 2 incidents during Avram's descent to Egypt. First, should he have left Israel at all? According to Ramban, this was a sin that brought a heavy punishment in its wake. And he quotes from Ramban translation, even leaving the land during famine was a sin. God would have saved him from starvation. For this action, his descendants were punished. I think I didn't share my screen. Sorry about that. Hold on. Let's fix that problem. That's better. Okay. We're out here in the middle of this first paragraph. God would have saved him from starvation. For this action, his descendants were punished with exile in Egypt under Pharaoh's rule. Okay, so that's the Ramban. The fact of Avram, with the in the first parak of this week's Parashah, says Vayira Av Ba'aretz Vayired Avram Mitzrayim Ela Gorsham. There was a famine in the land, and Avram went down to Egypt to dwell there. And the Ramban comments, part of why perhaps there's recourse to the commentaries here initially is because this is an analysis of the motivations or the consequences or the reaction to an action that the Torah doesn't really address. It just narrates it in and of itself. So Rav Bazak, needs to look at the commentaries to help us answer the question, was the behavior of this character appropriate or not appropriate? The text doesn't really clearly opine on it, but he wants to get to that next level of the narrative, a narrative analysis. So he quotes one opinion. We'll see that the text certainly accommodates both opinions in its silence. So the Ramban says going down to Egypt, which the Torah just narrates as a fact, was a sinful act. Abram should have stayed in the land and trusted that God was going to take care of him. Radak, however, sees this as a test that Abram faced and passed. Quoting Radak, this is one of the tests with which God tested our father Abraham. Abraham withstood them all and did not doubt God's ways by saying, Yesterday you promised the nations of the world. Yesterday you promised that the nations of the world would be blessed through me, and today the land is beset by famine such that I have to leave. Right? Rather, Abraham trusted in God and went down to Egypt, seeing that this is not at odds with having been promised the land. God promised in the land, but there was a famine. That means he needs to go down to Egypt. That's not a lack of faith in the fact that he ultimately will receive the land. It's doing the right thing he needs to do. When there's a famine, you have to go to where you can get food. And so going down to Egypt was the right thing to do. The test was actually, would he indeed be able to go down to know that going down to Egypt was the right thing to do and not a failure of God's promise to him. The commentators also disagreed about whether Avram should have presented Sarai as his sister. Ramban characterizes this too as a grave mistake. Quoting from Ramban, know that our father Abraham unwittingly sinned a great sin in placing his righteous wife into a situation where she might sin because he feared for his life. He ought to have trusted that God would save him, his wife, and all that he had. Radak once again gives Avram the benefit of the doubt. He did not rely on God's promise because he worried about sin. The correct behavior for every righteous person is not to rely on a miracle in a dangerous situation, but to take whatever action is necessary to protect himself. So, presenting Sarai as his sister was in order to save at least himself. The question of what this means for her is a complicated dimension of this analysis, but protects at least himself, and that was somehow the right thing to do. Hopefully, somehow ensures her safety as well. That was the right thing to do, as opposed to unwittingly a mistake, putting her in a compromised situation of potentially sinning. Okay, so we have this machloket between the Ramban and the Radak, which lines up, where in each case, Ramban says Avram's choice to go down to Egypt and Avram's choice to present Sarai as his sister were mistakes, and intentional or unintentional, but he should have just trusted in God and let things be as they were, stay in the land, and not misrepresent Sarai. And the Radak says in each case he's taking the human initiative that he's supposed to take to ensure his safety and well-being. These often kind of classify these as the sort of debate between, bitachon or emunah and hishtadlut, right? We're supposed to trust in God, but we're also supposed to do our human efforts to ensure our own safety and well-being. Now, Rabbi Zak sort of says, okay, well, do we have any indication from the text about what the text's attitude towards Abraham's choices was? And he says, it's hard to determine which of these positions is most closely aligned with the simple meaning of the text. Right? Radak and Ramban don't really quote proof texts. They're just looking at facts and saying, was this the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Even with Radak's positive view, one line in the text is somewhat jarring. And this on the presentation of Sarai as Avram's sister. Right? Imrina chotiat, please say that you are my sister. Laman yitavli va'avurech, that it may go well with me because of you. And that I may remain alive thanks to you. If there is no choice and his life is at stake, it is enough to say that I may remain alive, right? Why doesn't he just say that you are my sister so that I may remain alive? Because if it's a matter of life and death, that's all that's necessary. What's the meaning of the additional phrase that it may go well with me because of you? That sounds like it's not life and death. It's, life, but how good will it be? Rashi explains that what does it mean that it may go well with me because of you? That they will give me gifts. This seems correct because in the continuation of the story, it says, Ula Avram Heitiv Ba'avura. It went well with Avram because of her, meaning the thing he was hoping for in this presentation of identity was that it would go well for him. And then afterwards it says it went well for him because of Sarai. And what did that mean? He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. Would it be acceptable for Avram to explain from the outset that he was asking Sarai to do something difficult so that he could get gifts? Right? It's a doesn't land exactly right. So this is Rabbi Zak sort of saying the fact that when the text circles back to this impetus being that it go well for me, and the going well for me means not just surviving but prospering, then that seems like, is that really the sufficient motivation to put Sarai in a compromised position? Later on, and therefore he kind of sides a little bit more, it seems like, with the Ramban. Later on, he will refuse wealth from wicked people. He tells the king of Sodom, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say, it is I who made Avram rich, right? This is 2 chapters later, after the war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. When Avram is victorious, the king of Sodom, wants to give him some spoils. And Avram says, I'm not going to take anything because I don't want to appear that, I'm dependent on you or beholden to you because you've made me rich. It looks as though, now this is Rabbi Zak's reading these 2 stories in relationship with each other, not a literal cue here, right? It's not the wording of, went well doesn't appear here again, but he's looking at this thematic connection and this behavioral change that Avram somehow above is willing to do something in order to be prosperous. And down here, he has the opportunity to gain wealth and he turns it down. And he suggests here, okay, this indicates a change. And subtly beneath the surface, what it feels like is happening here is one of the modes of analysis that we've seen from Rabbi Zak, which is to say, if two stories seem at the face of it to be somewhat similar, then what do we learn from the difference? Now, these stories are not necessarily overall similar, but there's a dimension, that's parallel, which is the opportunity for prosperity in the Egypt encounter and now in the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings. And the difference is Avram is motivated by the desire for wealth in the first and rejects it in the second. It looks as though, Rabbi Zak now interprets, Avram reconsidered his behavior in Egypt and decided not to take money in negative circumstances. Indeed, when Avram finds himself in nearly identical circumstances, this is now later in the second Egypt sojourn, or here actually it's in Gerar, the second famine-induced sojourn, but not in Egypt, but in Gerar. In chapter 20, it says, Avram journeyed from there. While he was sojourning in Gerar, Avram said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. But again, here, doesn't seem to be about the desire for financial gain, but only seemingly survival. Perhaps this explains why, in this situation, God intervened directly with the king. I did not let you touch her, God says to Avimelech. This is something that apparently did not happen in Egypt. The difference between the two incidents suggests that Avram underwent a change between the first one and the second. And then kind of the last thing, which he doesn't say explicitly, but seems to be implied, is, and therefore that it wasn't exactly the right thing the first time around. So Rabbi Zak kind of opens up through this parallel and then difference, the opportunity for us to, it makes a gentler critique of Abraham, because he's showing us, okay, Abraham, yeah, maybe he did do the wrong thing by feeling, even if there was some danger, he sort of also acknowledges the motivation of, or the dimension of financial prosperity here in the Sarai situation in Egypt. And that wasn't the right thing, but we see that Avram learns his lesson. So it's sort of like, it's easier to criticize Avram in story number one if you can make it part of the arc of a narrative in which Avram, changes his behavior going forward. So this is, he doesn't wind up circling back to really address the question he asks in the first paragraph about whether going down to Egypt was the right thing or not the right thing. I don't think he has necessarily a textual hook to analyze that. But on the second piece about the presentation of Sarai as his sister, it seems like he sides more with the Ramban that it wasn't exactly the right thing to do, and then demonstrates that Avram sort of seems to learn that lesson between that instance and then two subsequent instances where he's not willing to accept wealth in negative circumstances. Okay, that's number one. Questions, comments, or thoughts on this piece? Okay. Great.
He still offers her up as his sister.
Yes. Yeah. So it seems like what Rabbi Zak, and it's not a perfectly clean read, but what Rabbi Zak is pointing out is that he doesn't say anything about money there, and somehow that makes it seem like there's by not even acknowledging or adding that motivation, it's sort of purely about his concern for safety. In the previous one, it seems like he has these mixed motivations. Like, it doesn't just say you're my sister so that I'll survive. It's so that I'll survive and it'll be good for me. And that somehow that tweaks the possibility, opens up the possibility that it wasn't only life or death, that it was sort of a mixture. It wasn't totally safe, but maybe he could have gotten by, but he also had the motivation of prosperity. Whereas because he doesn't mention that impetus in the Gerar story, and because he rejects any money in the in the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings story, so he's learned his lesson, and in particular in Gerar, it's it seems to only be about saving his life. It's not. I agree with you. It's not. There you can poke a hole a little bit, but that seems to be what's the differentiation for Rabbi Zak. Okay.
Would he argue it's the appropriate thing to do in the second situation because it was more about pikuach nefesh?
Yeah, it seems like it. It seems like that's what he's saying, that there was it was purely about saving life, and therefore it was warranted. Whereas in this one, there was this kind of admixture complexity of the financial And again, and so it wasn't clear that it was purely about saving life, and therefore it was not, beyond reproach in some way.
The message is not that he shouldn't have done it, but it's okay to do it under the right circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Seems like, yep. Yep. Okay. Let's go on to this one. Share my screen again. Okay. Coming to the other side of the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings, belief and knowledge. Rabbi Zak writes, after the war is over, and he's spoken about the war in a previous comment. Now he says, after the war is over, Avram has two questions for God. The first concerns the promise for children. He asks, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household is Damesek Eliezer. Avram said further, since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. So this was kind of question number one, what's happening with the promise of children. The second question concerns the promise of a land. O Lord God, how shall I know that I am to possess it? God answers the first question explicitly. Look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them. And God added, so shall your offspring be. Avram accepts this answer. And because he put his trust in the Lord, God reckoned it to his merit. Okay, let's just jump there to see this story in context a little bit more. Right, sometime later, after the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings, the word of God came to Avram in a vision. Fear not, Avram, I'm going to protect you. Your reward will be great. But Avram said, God, what can you give me, seeing I'm going to die childless? You've granted me no offspring. God comes back and says, Eliezer is not going to be your heir. You will have your own child. Go count the stars, so shall your offspring be. Avram trusts in God, and God reckons it to Avram's merit. And then God says, I'm God who took you out of Ur Kasdim to give this land to you as a possession. And Avram says, how am I supposed to know that I'm going to possess it? And the answer seems to be the covenant between the parts, Brit Bein HaBetarim. So now we're going to jump into that analysis. Okay, so question number one, what's the story with the children that you've promised me? It doesn't seem like I'm getting them. God says, yes, you are. That's coming. It's not Eliezer. It is offspring that will issue forth from you, and they will be numerous. And Avram seems to say, okay, and that he's sort of rewarded for that acceptance. But then, God says, you're going to get the land. And Avram says, how am I supposed to know that I'm going to get it? The second question is obscure. And its answer in the Brit Bein HaBetarim is even more obscure. According to Ramban, Avram did not doubt that he would inherit the land of Israel. He was not asking, interesting, so for the Ramban, by the way, who in the previous comment kind of critiqued Avram's lack of faith in going down to Egypt and presenting Sarah as his sister, now sort of sees Avram as having achieved more faith and trust, and says Avram didn't doubt that he would inherit the land. He was not asking, what is the sign, right? When Avram says, how do I know, Bama Eda Ki Irashena, how do I know that I'm going to inherit it? He wasn't asking, what is the sign, as happens in Malachim Bet, in a different story where he's asking for God to make a sign, right? He was not asking, what is the sign? For God did not make a miraculous sign. What Avram requested was to know for certain that he would inherit the land and that the inheritance would not be canceled by any sin that he or his descendants might commit, or by the repentance of the Canaanites. And God sealed a covenant with him that he would inherit it unconditionally. Okay, so for the Ramban, he wasn't saying, is this really going to happen at all? Show me a sign so that I will know that it was going to happen. But he's rather sort of saying, is it ironclad? Okay, I believe you that I'm going to inherit the land, but is it unconditional, or is it subject to some kinds of, external circumstances, right? Even the point about the repentance of the Canaanites, because God sort of says to him, the sin of the Canaanites is not complete, etc. So is there an external factor, even beyond Avram's control, that could impact his capacity to continue to lay claim to the land? So that's the Ramban. But Rabbi Zak says, however, the plain meaning, okay, again, we're always focused on the pshat here, the plain meaning seems to align more closely with Rashi's first comment there. And he believed in God. Avram did not ask for any miraculous sign about the promise of children. But in the case of inheriting the land, Avram did ask for a sign. As he said, how shall I know? So the Rashi seems to understand that Bamai Dakir Ashena, not like the Ramban, that it was just asking for, absolute certainty, but that it was really asking for any indication, is this really going to happen at all? That's Rashi's comment, and Rabbi Zak says the plain sense of the text seems more like that. But Rabbi Zak goes on, if Avram did indeed ask for a sign, what sign did he receive? Ramban correctly points out that God did not provide any miraculous sign that Avram would inherit the land of Israel. It seems that God did not respond to Avram's request. If he was really asking for a sign, he didn't get an answer. Avram wanted to know the land would be his. But the only knowledge he is granted is that his descendants will be exiled from the land. And now he comes to a word-based analysis here. Avram asks, how shall I know? Bameh Eda. And God answers, know well, Yadoa Teda, that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. I will just see that inside for a moment. Avram's question here was, God tells him, I'm going to took you out of Or Kasdim to give you the land. And he says, Bama Eda Kirashana, how am I going to know? And God tells him, take these animals and create this Brit Bein Avatarim. And the first words that God says to Avram when Avram does the staging of the Brit is Yadoa Teda. You shall surely know that your offspring are going to be strangers, enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, etc. So the knowledge, so Rabbi Zak is just pointing out, look at this was an important verb. Avram asks, how am I going to know? What am I going to know? And God answers, here's what you're going to know. You're going to know that actually you're not going to get to stay in the land, at least certainly not initially. Brit Bein Abatarim hardly feels upbeat. It is accompanied by dread, great darkness, and swooping birds of prey. Even the prophecy that Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Hena, they shall return here in the fourth generation, is neither a sign nor a promise that Avram's descendants will live permanently on the land, right? It's just a response to their initial departure from the land. They're going to come back, but are they going to come back and never leave again? It's not clear. And again, it's a prophetic promise, but no sign. All that Avram learns here is that the Jewish people are destined to endure great difficulties through the generations. See, for example, the words of Moshe and Devarim, for I know that when I am dead, you will act wickedly, and that in time to come, misfortune shall befall you, right? So just a little, another indication of knowledge is not a great, not an upbeat thing to know, not an optimistic knowledge. The strength of the nation in these dark days will not be knowledge, but belief in the promise that to your offspring I assign this land. Maaseh avot siman levanim, the acts of the forefathers foreshadow those of their children. God does not respond to Avram's request by giving him a sign, because what use would a sign be to future generations who had not seen it? The message of the Brit Bein Abatarim, which follows, Vehemin ba'Hashem, right, which comes after the Vehemin ba'Hashem, is that the Jewish people will surely suffer, but they will surely endure because of their belief in God's promise. Okay, so this is again, Rabbi Zak, maybe a little bit moving towards the homiletical, but he's pointing out that, okay, the only knowledge was the knowledge that it's not going to be so great. So then what is the takeaway? What is the answer to how will I know that they will inherit it? There is no knowledge which is given. So then he sort of says, let's back up to the fact that what gave Avram kind of strength in the previous question, the answer to the previous question about children, was he had faith in God, and that was to his merit. So Rabbi Zak sort of says, when the only knowledge is knowledge of difficult things which are going to befall the Jewish people, then kind of fall back on faith, and that at least provides strength in the absence of concrete knowledge. So that's, again, it's not a precise sort of reading at the end, but just noting that the knowledge doesn't really answer the question. And if we go back to the previous question, the question about children, their faith provided some security, and that's all the security one can have in this instance. Okay, questions, comments here. So again, just to the key text words are this movement and tension between, between da'at, between this verb of yeda, and the sort of stance of faith. Okay, we'll do one more, see where we stand at that point. Okay. Hagar, reward and punishment. Let's just see the story briefly, to remind ourselves of the context. We have the kind of two Hagar stories. They sometimes get a little blurred in my head, so we'll refresh our memory of where we're up to at this stage in Lech Lecha. So Sarai has no children. She has her Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. She says to Avram, sleep with Hagar, maybe through her I will be built up. And Avram listens, and Hagar is given to Avram as a concubine. They sleep together. She gets pregnant. When Hagar saw that she was pregnant, then Sarai became lighter in her eyes. She became less subservient to Sarai. And Sarai says to Avram, this is your fault. Not clear exactly how, but okay, this is your fault. I gave her over to you, and now that she sees she's pregnant, I've been lowered in her eyes. Same phrase here, va'ikal be'inaha, meaning it's interesting the way the narrator describes Hagar's action or view of Sarai is literally the words that Sarai uses to describe it herself, which is her lightening view in Hagar's eyes. And Avram says to Sarai, okay, do what you think is right. I'm already foreshadowing Rav Bazak here by just highlighting these phrases. Asila hatov beinaich, which literally translates as do with her what is good in your eyes. They translate here, deal with her as you think right. Vata'aneha Sarai treats her harshly and she ran away. A malach, a messenger of God, finds her by an ein hamayim, a spring of water in the wilderness. Says, where have you come from and where are you going? She says, I'm running away from Sarai. And this same messenger of God says, Shuvi al gavirtech, go back to your mistress. V'hit ani tachat yadeha, and submit to her harsh treatment. The malach says further, I'm going to increase your offspring. There'll be too many to count. And further, you're pregnant, and you're going to have a child. You're going to call him Yishmael, because God has paid heed to your suffering. He will be a here adam, a wild ass of a person, with his hand against everyone and everyone else's hand against him, and he will dwell alongside all of his kin. Okay, and the place is called Be'er Lachai Roi, and Hagar gives birth, and Avram names him Yishmael. Okay. After Hagar flees into the desert to escape from Sarai, so we're mid-story here already, she meets an angel of God. The angel's words to Hagar may be divided into three separate utterances. Remember, we sort of said, the angel said, and said further, and said further. The first two are, and the angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her harsh treatment. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly increase your offspring, and they will be too many to count. The juxtaposition of these two statements is puzzling, particularly from Hagar's perspective. On the one hand, she is to return to a difficult situation. On the other, she is promised a great reward, similar to the one promised to Abraham. I'll bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sands on the seashore. And Yaakov, these are all later, of course. I will deal bountifully with you and make your offspring as the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. Meaning, this is kind of a covenantal, numerous progeny promise that she's getting here. How can we understand this duality, right? If this is a covenantal promise, it's sort of a good thing, and yet she's being told to go back and submit to her mistress. And it's not that they're contradictory. They're just sort of, one seems like a indication of good, and the other is a recognition of, or demand for continued suffering. The conflict is mediated by the angel's third statement. I'm sorry, I don't have the Hebrew of Rav Bazak's essay in front of me. It sounds like one of the 13 hermeneutical principles. When two texts conflict with each other, you wait ad she'yavo hakatuv hashlishi v'yachliya beinehem. The third text, resolves the dispute. So this conflict is mediated by the angel's third statement. Behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call him Yishmael, for the Lord has paid heed to your suffering. Aniyech. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell alongside all of his kinsmen. Here too, we see two opposing realities. Hagar will bear a child, for God has heeded her suffering. Radak understands Anyech as your cry or your prayer. Here, however, the word alludes to the circumstances of Hagar's prayer. Right? Sarai had treated her harshly, Vate'aneha, and that's what caused Hagar to run away. Hagar's prayer stands out in comparison to Sarai's behavior. Sarai does not pray about her barrenness, and moreover, she deals harshly with Hagar. See Ramban and Radak there. Hagar merited the promise of children and the birth of Yishmael. So again, he's basing himself on Radak here to sort of develop this slight contrast between Sarai's behavior and Hagar's behavior, that Hagar prays in a way that Sarai does not, and that's sort of noteworthy in some way. And again, we see these two opposing realities. There's the answer to her prayer and the blessing of the child, but also the suffering. We should not, however, ignore the reason for Sarai's treatment of Hagar. Okay, we could be critical of it, but we have to look at the context. When Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress was lowered in her esteem, right? In her eyes. Just as Hagar's positive characteristics come to light through ani, here prayer, her negative characteristics are displayed through ayin, eyes, right? Through her view of Sarai, which has become a less respectful view. When Sarai's status is lowered in Hagar's eyes, Avram says to Sarai, deal with her according to what is good in your eyes, hatov be'inayich. Then Hagar flees to the desert, where she encounters the angel by a spring of water, Ain, in the wilderness, the spring Ain on the road to Shul. Shul itself, by the way, is interesting because it can mean something having to do with sight in some contexts also. As punishment for her defiance, Hagar will bear a son who defies control. This explains the angel's first statement. Hagar must return and pay the price for her disrespect. So on the one hand, she prays honestly and faithfully. That's one, her, ani, and her prayer is answered and she receives blessing. On the other hand, her banishment was because of her mistreatment, the way she viewed with her eyes her mistress, and therefore the child will also kind of bear these kind of conflicting characteristics, and also she has to go back and deal with the mess that she made back home. Later on, we see a further problematic side to Hagar. She does not seem to recognize that she can help save her son. This is in the second story, the one that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Only Yishmael's prayer brings about salvation, right? Then it says, then after Yishmael cries out praise, then God opened her eyes, Eineha, and she saw a well of water. So this sort of challenge about seeing, how you see the situation and whether you see a possibility for resolution, circles back again with Hagar. So it's interesting. It's in the layout here. I don't know if it's because it's shorter or the way Rabbi Zak sort of wants to develop this line of thought, but rather than sort of saying, okay, the key word here is this idea of ayin and anyi, and let's see how it plays out, kind of narrates the kind of analysis that allows it to unfold, kind of cause and effect one step at a time by using this thread of this term. And it's sort of, once you see it, no pun intended, you really can't unsee it as this sort of central theme. And it's interesting then again, in light of that, that the story ends with her, calling God El Roi, and saying Agam Halom Ra'iti Acharei Roi, and therefore the place being called Be'er Lachai Roi. So even though it's a different term, it's the same theme, eye and sight. And Be'er Lachai Roi winds up becoming an important place, in this kind of first two generations of Abram and Sarai and Hagar and Yishmael and Yitzchak, and their relationships. So it's this notion of seeing, suffering, view, is sort of this core idea in this story. Comments or thoughts on this one? I know it's a lot to digest. Squeeze in one more before we wrap up. Okay. Rainbow and circumcision. This is sort of, again, a nice continuity to an essay we saw last time. Last time was the rainbow on its own terms, the meaning of the symbol as the God's weapon being kind of covered up or returned to its scabbard by being in the cloud. Rabbi Zak pointed this out last week, that each appearance of Keshet, the rainbow in chapter 9, is Kashti, my bow, and it's always associated with the cloud, that's sort of God putting down God's weapon and not shooting flood rain arrows out of that bow anymore, but instead putting it back into a concealed place, which is the function of clouds in a number of biblical narratives. Okay, so now we're going to take that story, which we analyzed on its own terms and without too much recourse to other texts, and now put it in conversation with a covenant in our parashah. The commandment of Brit Milah in our parashah has many parallels with the story of the rainbow in Parshat Noach. God proclaims that the rainbow is the sign that I set for the covenant between me and you, in chapter 9. Similarly, circumcision is referred to as the covenant between me and you and your offspring. Both are referred to as an eternal covenant. Both covenants are preceded by a blessing of fertility, be fertile and increase and fill the earth, right? The promise given to Noach, or blessing given to Noach. And here to Avram, I will make you exceedingly numerous, I will make you exceedingly fertile. Both covenants are to be accompanied by a change. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth, and you shall no longer be called Avram. The words brit, covenant, and basar, flesh, both appear numerous times in these sections. Now here he doesn't specifically talk about multiples of 7, but I think that there are some in each. The similarities between the two covenants highlight their differences. Okay, we've already seen that as a kind of classic Rav Bazak approach to his analysis of the Pshat. Set up the parallels, there's something to learn from the parallels, and it also highlights the differences which teach something else. The covenant of the rainbow was with Noach as a representative of all humanity. The covenant is between me and all flesh that is on earth. The covenant of circumcision is enacted with Abraham and only with his son Yitzchak. I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. This is familial, not with all flesh, but only with the descendants of Abraham and Yitzchak, who are willing to circumcise the flesh of their foreskins. Thus does God mark God's relationship with a subset of humanity. Again, this is not a radical insight. We are certainly know that in the movement from Noach to Lech, we're moving from the universal to the particular, but he's sort of pointing out to us how that plays out in the covenantal portions at the end of each of these two parshiot, or near the end of these two parshiot. This exclusive relationship demands that man acts as well. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Again, he's pointing out a contrast between the two. God doesn't really ask anything of all of humanity when it comes to the sign of the rainbow. It's just God's commitment. And I mean, there are other things in the context of that story, but in the way the covenant is presented and the rainbow is presented, there's no ask of human beings. Whereas here, as God is kind of moving into a narrower relationship and promising something to a specific group, it comes along with the expectation of this action on the part of that specific group, the act of circumcision. The universal covenant of the rainbow is tied to the entire world, and particularly to the earth. It expresses the connection between humanity and the earth. I will maintain my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Not only will humanity be spared, so will the land. The covenant of circumcision being particular to the Jewish people, is tied to a far smaller geographical area, the land of Israel. I assign the land you sojourn in to you and your offspring to come. All the land of Canaan is an everlasting holding. The land of Israel is designated for the people of Israel. When the descendants of Abram and Yitzchak live in Israel, the second clause of the covenant comes into effect. I will be their God. So there's a specific action which is asked for, and there's a specific kind of geographic area of promise. And I think it's also interesting just to see the way the fact that basar, flesh, is used in both is interesting, because you don't necessarily need to use such an embodied word to talk about, in chapter 9, in the covenant of the rainbow, in the promise of the rainbow. It just means people. It doesn't mean the flesh of the body, where the Brit Milah is taking place in chapter 17. So the fact that basar is used there as well definitely strengthens the connection between these two passages. But again, it's a different thing. Basar in chapter 9 just means just a way of referring to all people. And basar in chapter 17 is literally the body on which this covenant is being carried out. So we see the parallels between the two, and then the differences that highlight the particular people and land where this covenant is being carried out in our Parashah, as opposed to the universal humanity and all the earth in the first one. All right. Lot to take in, 4 essays. Just I'll give a super quick refresh. In the first one, we saw the question of whether Avram's choice to go down to Canaan, rather to go down to Egypt and present Sarai as his sister, was indicative of a lack of faith or of a commitment to express human agency where appropriate in dangerous situations. And Rav Bazak, based on the kind of way one of the phrases of "that may go well with me" plays out, suggests along the lines of the Ramban that, at least on the second question, presenting Sarai as his sister had this kind of contaminated is not exactly the right word, but is dampened in some way by the motivation for prosperity, and the fact that in subsequent 2 stories, Avram doesn't have that motivation seems to indicate that he kind of learned his lesson. It wasn't a perfect approach the first time around, and subsequently, those things are not present. They shouldn't be a factor. Only a question of life or death would motivate, putting someone in the compromised position that Avram did do. And then we moved on to, after the War of the 4 Kings and the 5 Kings, in the lead up to the covenant between the parts, to Brit Bein HaBetarim, we saw Avram's 2 questions about offspring and land. When it came to offspring, God answers affirmatively, and Avram kind of accepts that on faith. When it comes to the land, Avram does seem to actually ask for a sign, and doesn't get it. And in fact, when he asks for that sign in order to provide him with knowledge, how can I know? Give me a sign so I can really know. God, when that verb appears again in the covenant between the parts, all the knowledge is knowledge of bad things that are going to happen, and God never gives him affirmative knowledge that he's going to have the land forever. And so Rabbi Zak sort of ends by saying, therefore, the only recourse Avram has is to circle back to trust and faith, because knowledge won't get him as far as he wants to go. In the third essay we looked at the key word or root of ayin and ani in Hagar's relationship with Sarai, and kind of Hagar's the duality of the fact that Hagar is both given covenantal type promises, but also told that she has to go back and suffer. And this reflects the fact that she didn't have the right view, didn't look upon Sarai in the right way when she got pregnant. And yet she had this sort of prayerful posture. So she winds up with her prayers being answered, but also having to continue to suffer. And we also see kind of a imperfection in her vision play out in the subsequent story, in which she doesn't have the capacity to see the kind of salvation for Yishmael, only his prayer or his cry leads to that vision. And then in the fourth comment, we looked at the parallel between the covenant at the end of last week's Parashah of the rainbow and the covenant at the end of our Parashah of Brit Milah. Lots of literary parallels, and the main differences pointing out the movement from the universal to the particular. Thanks, everybody. Great to learn together. See you next week.
Thanks very much.